Hello, everybody. Today we'll talk about single responsibility principle in ReactJS. So, by definition, single responsibility principle means each module or each function or each piece of code should be responsible for only one thing. And in ReactJS, as React is more structured in a component-oriented structure, I mean, React projects are basically a collection of components. What I mean is each component should have a single responsibility. But unfortunately, that's not the case in real life. So when you are going to work on real life projects, you will notice that these principles are not always maintained, and it results in a very poor developer experience. Any feature takes a lot of time to add. The other developers have a lot of difficulty to understand anything about a particular code base. So today we will see uh, an example, an example component. It's taken from a real world project, and we will see why this component is bad and how we can refactor these kind of components in ReactJS for better maintainability. Just a disclaimer that these are mostly my personal experience, so not everybody will be agreeing with all of those. But I think these are some good practices to follow, at least to start with. So let's first see the actual component. So this is a graph component. So this is a very familiar example. It's basically it fetches some data and shows it in a graph. So let's see how this component is structured. Let me zoom in a bit. So the first part is just the imports. Then here we have some constants. So these constants are used to show the graph properly in a meaningful way. Then we have the component. It has the props and everything. Then here we have some state variables. Uh, we have some data fetching going on here, and we have a bad way of fetching data here as well. So it is using a use effect to get the data, then filtering the data, and then setting the data in the state. Then we have some custom logic of filtering through the data. Here you can see that date formatter, right? Chart data filter. So different kind of filters and formatting utility functions going on here. Then we have the custom tooltip component inside the actual parent component here. And we have some custom logic here as well on how to render this tooltip. Uh, then we have some calculations going on. As you can imagine, as it's a graph component, a lot of computation calculation is going on here actually, converting data from one shape to another shape, things like that. And finally, we have the actual component where we have different parts of the graph. Now, what's wrong with this component? The first thing is if you see a component that reaches over 400 lines, the first thing is it's very hard to understand. It's very hard to follow. Although it says graph component, and it's actually a better example. In real life, you will see even worse example. I personally have seen a component with like 3000 lines, a single React component. As you can imagine, if you are a developer trying to add a simple feature, it will take you days just to understand what this component is doing. Because if you break something or change something, it may break something else. So a lot of problems. So this is the example now. Just to make it easy to understand, I have drawn a diagram here showing how this particular component is working. Here is our component in question. We have some imports, then we have some constant values, then we are fetching some data, filtering some data. We are using some custom logic, custom filtering, right? Data formatting and things like that. Then we have some custom components inside the component, and then we have the actual render code. I have marked in red some of the parts. So basically, these are all the things that should not live in your component, ideally, right? It can, there are some exceptions. If it's a small component, yeah, obviously you put the constants there. Maybe you can put the data fetching there as well. It depends on the situation, but ideally, if you're working on a large code base, you should not put these red items into your component itself. Two reasons. The first reason is your component should be responsible for only one thing. So it should not worry about how data is being fetched, how data is being filtered, or things like that. A component's main job is to show something, is to render something. In React.js, a page or a component, its main job is to render something. For doing the calculations, there are several approaches. I will talk about those as well. But let's first understand the philosophy that we are trying to say here. The philosophy is a component should be as stupid as possible. Ideally, it will just take in some props or even zero props and just show some stuff, right? For example, what is an ideal component? So let's do have a React component here, and it will just show, let's say, anything. So this is kind of a pure React functional component. It doesn't take anything at all, and it always returns a consistent result. It and the main power of React is in the prop. So let's say you add a prop here. Let's say you add a name, and then you show the name here, right? So now it turns into it's still a presentational component, which is just taking some props and showing it here. But that is our ideal component. It's so stupid. It doesn't know anything about how to show something, right? It just sees that what is coming and it's presenting it. So we should always try, no matter how large the project is, we should always try to create our components as dumb as possible. So in this case, this bat component that I just showed, the ideal scenario is it's a graph component. Its only responsibility is to show the graph. So potentially it will just take in some data as props and render the graph. That's it. Now, it's easy to say, but how should we do it? How should we approach something like it? So I will share my approach. Obviously, it can vary from project to project and convention. Different projects have different conventions, things like that. But I will just show my approach, what I do usually. Here you can see that this is our ideal component now. It has some import statements, the actual component. It just renders some stuff, nothing else, right? No logic is going on here. So probably we'll just take some props here, maybe, right? Just props, right? So these props will just go in and it will just render the graph. That's it. Now, what will come in these props? All of these things will come through these props. How? So the first thing is the constants. Remember, we had the constants here. So usually, if these constants are very specific to a file, keep that in that particular component. But most of the case, that's not the in most scenarios that's not the case because constants are usually shared between different components. So put those in your constants file. Then for data fetching, obviously you should use something like a React query or your custom hook, whatever it is. But using use effect to fetch data in the component itself is not a good idea. It works. It's maybe it will not have that much performance issues as well. But for simplicity's sake, take your data fetching logic into a custom hook. That's the simplest part. With data fetching, then comes the data filtering and formatting, right? Everything like that. They should go to your utils folder, right? You can just write some pure functions and just export the functions from the utils and use it everywhere. For example, in our case, here you will see that we had a date formatter, right? This date formatter function is probably can be used by other in other places as well. So do not include it in your component. Put it into utils file and share it through for other components as well. And the most thing that I see is rendering custom logics inside the component itself. For example, it often happens when we have a list of items that we need to render in a particular component, and people just write a function that uh, filters through the data and create the components, and then we call that function inside the render. Let's just create some child components, right? React has that. It's intended for that. And you can just create some child components and include those into your parent component. In fact, it is not so bad even if you put these components into this file itself, right? So let's say I have the child component one, its code included in this parent component. No problem. You can do that if it's very related and it doesn't need to be shared across multiple places. But don't put it inside the components code because it introduces more rendering cycle, right? If you don't maintain it properly, you can try to add use memo or things like that, but it will just make it worse. So why do it? So that's the idea basically. So what I usually do is whenever I'm working on any project, if I see that a component is doing too much, uh, if I have capacity, if I have some time, it's both on the front end and the back end, but in this particular case, I'm only talking about React. So when you have too much code in a particular component, it's never a good idea. It's probably meaning that you are doing more than one thing in that component, and it's clearly violating the single responsibility principle. So that's how you can strive for better code quality on your projects. So yeah, that's what I wanted to talk about today. Hope you learned something new and have a great day. Feel free to like, share, subscribe, whatever. Thank you.